Okay, I believe this is recording. One thing that I did not, another thing that I neglected to do last time was to point out that it is okay to be interactive in this time. I know it's very strange how we're set up. We're wearing masks or face shields. We're recording it, but I want you to feel absolutely comfortable to interrupt me, tell me when I'm saying something wrong, ask questions, whatever you might like, okay? So it's totally fine to be interactive. Today we're talking about the date of the Exodus. I mentioned last time that that would be our topic today. Like last time, I have a 5-page document. Like last time, I have only the one copy, which I'm going to hold on to. If you go to the ECC website and find the ECC YouTube channel, you can do that by, if you go there right now, there's a big picture of these big waves for Dan's Jonah study that he's starting. And in the top left corner, there's a circle, a small circle that says has ECC's logo or something like that on it. You click on that, it will take you to the church's YouTube channel, and then you can find the video from last week from this ACG. If you click on that video, underneath the video you can say see more information, and there are, I think, 3 links to downloadable files where you can get a copy of the document from last time, as well as the 2 graphs that I showed you. They were really small on paper. You can see the full big graphs that way. I don't know how long those links are going to stay up. The videos do not stay up more than a couple of weeks, maybe just 1 week, because otherwise we have too much data on the YouTube channel. So that video and the links attached to it will be going away sometime soon, but they'll be replaced by the newer videos. So today's video, hopefully later today, maybe tomorrow, will be up, and if you go find it, click on more information, you'll be able to find a link to this document to download if you'd like to do that. Yeah, we talked last time about sort of introductory matters. This time we're going to talk about the date of the Exodus. And just so that there's no questions running around in the back of your mind while we're going through this, I'll just tell you up front, there are 2 main opinions about when the date of the Exodus is, when the Exodus happened. Okay, there's a late date and an early date that have both been proposed, and both have been espoused by the church and by people outside the church, really for centuries. The early date is around 1450 BC, and the late date is around, not quite 200 years later, maybe around 1260 BC. And my opinion at this time, is that the late date is the more likely to be accurate, around 1260 BC. Today we will spend time looking into what the biblical evidence is for both of those dates, and we'll also, as we do so, we'll bring in archaeological information and ancient texts and stuff like that. At the bottom of it all, we do not know when the Exodus happened, but we can talk about what's the evidence for this date or that date, and how does it work. So you can, now you know where I'm heading anyway. Well, yeah, but you can decide for yourselves. We'll look at the evidence both ways. I want to start with talking about how we keep track of time and how we identify when historical events take place. And to that end, I have drawn a little, I guess you could call it a chart, up on the board here. We have all of human history, which is always in the past, right? If it hasn't happened yet, it's not part of history, that's part of the future. But human history in the past, from today going back to the beginning, for our purposes, I think it's safe to divide human history into two broad eras. The modern era, which is where we live, and the ancient era, which is where the ancient Israelites and the ancient Egyptians lived. Okay? In real life, this boundary is probably very complex, and I don't know where I would put that boundary, what year I would put it at. But that doesn't matter. For our purposes, there's ancient history and there's modern history. In ancient times, there were ancient people who experienced ancient events, and they could talk about when those ancient events happened. In modern times, we are modern people, and we experience modern events. And we can talk about when these modern events happened. We can also talk about when the ancient events happened. So I'll kind of draw that line over there like that. We have that advantage, I guess, that the ancient people did not have. They couldn't talk about modern events as history because they hadn't happened yet. But we can talk about the ancient events. So there are three different lines here connecting people to events. Nowadays, in the modern era, when we are talking about modern events, we typically talk about when events happened in very precise and absolute terms. We can say what day precisely we were born on. We might not know what day of the week it was offhand, but we know the date, the month, and the year. We can say exactly what day it was when Abraham Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln was a modern person. He could say very precisely 77 years ago. If you take the date of the Gettysburg Address, subtract 87 years, 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed. Okay? We can say exactly when the different kings and queens of England and France and all of these other things, all these historical events from the modern age, we can talk about when they happened with a high degree of precision. We have a date. In ancient times, before I go there though, it all sounds extremely precise, and it is, but we still have our cases of uncertainty. For example, my dad and I, several years ago, were trying to find out some stuff about our family tree, and we found out that I have a great-great-great-grandmother who immigrated to the U.S. from, I think, Luxembourg. And if you look at U.S. Census records and passenger ship manifests and her gravestone, and you try to figure out what year was she born, you get different years. And it's not off by 1, it's off by 5. So what year was she actually born? We're not sure. In the end, we decided to go with what the gravestone said, because after all, that's where it's written in stone. But the point is, even today, even in recent history, as precise and exact as our dating system is, there are still uncertainties, and in some cases it's not that hard to find ambiguities, or we might call them paradoxes. The same is totally true in ancient times. In ancient times, though, the dating system that people tended to use was not an absolute dating system like ours, where you could say in the year 1250 BC, in the month of January, on the 15th day of the month. You wouldn't tell time that way. Instead, they used a relative dating system, one of several relative dating systems, often linked to who was the pharaoh, who was the king. Okay, so in the Bible, for instance, in the 480th year, I'm getting ahead of myself. Wrong number. In the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, on the, the first day of the month? It doesn't say the first day of the month. Just in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month. 1 Kings 6, 1. On that day, or in that month of the 4th year of Solomon's reign, Solomon began to build the temple. Okay? The dating scheme for when the temple was built, or began to be built, is relative to the beginning of Solomon's reign. Right away, in ancient history, we start running into problems because we don't necessarily know offhand whether that first year of Solomon's reign, whether the 4th year of Solomon's reign is the 4th year that he ruled for the entire year, or if the first year of Solomon's reign began the year before when he started to rule, maybe in June or July. I don't know what month Solomon started ruling, but suppose he started ruling in July. Do you count that first 6 months of his reign as a full year, the first year of his reign? And then when the calendar turns over to a new year, is that now the second year? If it is, then the 4th year of Solomon's reign is a year earlier than if you say, we're not going to count that first half year, we'll start with the full calendar year. Ancient events were dated both ways, depending on what part of the ancient Near East you were in, and depending on exactly what time era you lived in. Okay, it is probable that the early monarchy, the reigns of Saul, David, Solomon, for instance, that in the early monarchy, the dates were measured one way. I don't remember which way. They were measured one of those two ways. Whereas later, when the divided monarchy was more heavily influenced by Assyrian and Babylonian culture, they dated it differently, and so the later kingdoms started doing the dating a different way as well. Okay? Again, I don't remember which way it goes, but yes, Vicki.
I'm just thinking that we still do that a little bit with our birthdays. We count our years.
Yes.
From our birthday, and even though we're in another year, we're still counting our numbers like that. So
that's right.
That makes sense in that way for us. So it probably makes sense for them.
That's a great point, yeah. So yeah, there are different ways of reckoning time, even today, even when we have our more absolute dating system. We can talk about a specific year, which is universal and not tied to a particular king's reign. Of course, that's only partly true. Our universal dating system is dated according to the reign of King Jesus, right? But in ancient times, that they didn't have that, and so dating was done differently. Consequently, when we, modern people, try to talk about events in the ancient world, and we try to date those events, we're dealing with a very different sort of problem than when we're trying to date modern events. The ancient events, maybe there's an inscription that describes when a particular battle happened. The inscription does not tell us exactly what year, by our dating system, exactly what year that battle happened in. It tells us it was, so-and-so was the king. Maybe it tells us what year of the king's reign. But then we still have to ask, okay, starting with what part of his reign? The half year that he reigned before, or the full year that the first full year that he reigned? We don't have that precise information, so we have to piece together information, evidence from a variety of sources to try to figure out dating schemes for ancient times. The other problem, of course, is that we don't have all of those ancient records. We have a few inscriptions that tell us when, roughly speaking, when a few ancient events happened. We don't have all the records that tell us when all of the events happened according to so-and-so's dating scheme, or Egypt's dating scheme, or Assyria's dating scheme. Okay, so the Exodus is back here, yeah.
Do you think, because the library in Alexandria was burned,
Mhm.
and maybe there was a lot of records there that got lost with all this information on it?
Yes, there was more than one ancient library that we know about. The Library at Alexandria was one of the great wonders of the ancient world, and we know that when it was destroyed, there were a lot of things that were lost at that point. There were other libraries that have been destroyed since the ancient, from the ancient world, and so we know, for instance, from some documents that have been preserved that there used to exist such and such a book, or such and such a copy of a book. We also know that we have no idea where that is now, if it still exists. We would love to find a copy of that. And maybe someday we will somewhere. But it is true that over the millennia, things have happened, books have been lost, possibly irreparably, and that is enough to sometimes make a person cry. At least a person like me. Anyway, so we're dealing with the Exodus, which is ancient history, and the evidence that we're looking for is part of ancient history, ancient texts, the Bible, for instance, and yet we are modern people, and we do have a tendency to try to want to impose our modern sensibilities of how accurately time should be dated on the way that the ancients dated time and left evidence for time and for when events happened. Okay, very quickly, we have to gather a variety of different kinds of evidence to try to zero in on when an event happened, and some of those different types of evidence include things like what kinds of tools. Let's see, we need another chair. Hi there, you can come sit over here.
Thank you.
One of the things that we can do, we're talking about how do we find out from various kinds of evidence when ancient events happened. So one thing we can do is we can look for what kinds of tools do we find buried in the ground? What kinds of pieces of equipment do we find being referred to or being painted on palace walls or etched in stone monuments? By and large, we can talk very broadly about stone tools and bronze-made tools and iron-made tools. And those very broad categorizations help us to define in very broad brushstrokes whether an event happened in the Stone Age or in the Bronze Age or in the Iron Age. Those different ages do not have known set boundaries. It's sort of like this boundary right here. What's the boundary between ancient and modern? Is it the year 1 AD? Or is it the year 10 AD? Is it 200 BC? Is it 800 AD? Maybe we say that when Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, that's when we draw the line. We don't know where to draw this line exactly. It's fuzzy. The boundaries between Stone Age and Bronze Age, and between Bronze Age and Iron Age, are also very fuzzy. And it's based on what do we find in the ground and in the inscriptions and in the drawings and paintings and whatnot. Okay. We also know that the time that the Bronze Age happened in, for instance, is not the same by relative dating in all parts of the ancient world. The Bronze Age started, whenever it started at a particular time in Egypt, and that's different from when the Bronze Age started in Turkey, or Greece, or Spain, or India. Okay, so when we talk about Bronze Age or Iron Age, we're talking not based on absolute dating, but we're talking about what kinds of materials are used to make the tools. What's the technology like at that time? The Exodus, by the way, happened during the Bronze Age. I should say if it happened. And I told you last time, I think it did happen, but not everybody agrees with that. If it happened during the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age, by the way, can be further divided up into early, middle, and late Bronze Age, and there's further subdivisions. The Exodus would have happened in the mid or late Bronze Age. So what kinds of tools and pieces of equipment do we find? That helps us to define when something happened in the ancient world. Another thing that we can use to date events is fashion. Just like today, fashions change every now and then. We used to have, when I grew up, we had some very good friends who had a really thick kind of baby blue shag carpet. You don't find those anymore. That's right. Walls used to be painted sort of burnt orange. We don't have that anymore. Bell bottoms have been in style. Bell bottoms have come back in style and gone back out of style. Fashions change, and even in the ancient world, fashion existed and fashions changed from time to time. In the ancient world, the kinds of fashions that we can identify are usually based on styles of pottery, styles of painting, including how many colors are in the painting, and what are the motifs that we see again and again in different kinds of paintings. Textiles, what kinds of textiles are being used, what kinds of jewelry are being produced, what's the material that the jewelry is made out of, even what's the layout of the house. You know, these things all change over time, and we can use things that we find in the ground, bits of pottery, bits of paintings, pieces of jewelry, outlines of the foundations of a house. We can use all that to help us identify when a particular thing happened. Okay. We tend to assume, for simplicity's sake, that in a region like the ancient Near East, which is, yeah, it's not small, but it's also not a huge region. So we tend to assume that fashion was kind of similar across the ancient Near East from one end to the other. And fashions changed at about the same time in all of these different places in the ancient Near East. We tend to assume that unless we have specific evidence telling us otherwise. Okay, so that introduces some uncertainty as well. Talking about Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, lots of uncertainty as to exactly when these things happened. Talk about fashions, lots of uncertainty about that as well. Not as much. We're narrowing down. We're now down to maybe 100-year period instead of several hundred years. But there still is some uncertainty. Another piece of evidence that we can use is inscriptions and writings that we find on rock faces or underground. For instance, remember the unknown city that we talked about last time, Yanoam, which Vicki came up to me afterward and said we should have called it You Don't Know 'Em, because we don't really know where it is. But the site of Tel Esh-Shihab, that's the modern day name for the mound that used to be a city, That's probably where Unoam was located, ancient Unoam. And the reason we think, or one of the primary reasons we think that that's where Unoam actually was, is because archaeologists digging there, what was it, about 100 years ago, I think? Yeah, about 100, 125 years ago, people discovered a small stela. Remember, a stela is a stone monument. They found a stone stela from Seti the First, Pharaoh Seti the First, indicating that Seti the First probably was there at one time during his reign and conquered it and left a monument to make sure that the inhabitants of Unoam remembered who won. Okay? Seti the First, what we know from inscriptions in Egypt, went and campaigned against Unoam. And the inscriptions in Egypt describe the geography, the landscape around Unoam, and it fits very well with where this site, Tel Shahab, is located. So for all those reasons, we think that's probably Unoam. A big piece of the evidence is this stela, this inscribed stone. So those kinds of things, inscriptions and text documents that we might find, either on stone or painted onto pottery, or clay tablets that have been buried, those sorts of things help us to further narrow down, okay, that city was around in the time of a particular pharaoh. Now we can get down to decades, and maybe even sometimes to specific years. The Merneptah stela, which we talked about last time, is an example where we can come down to a specific year. Now, of course, I don't remember what that year is. I think it was the 5th year of Merneptah's reign. Okay, so we have a specific year. We don't have it in absolute time. We don't know for sure that that was 1209 BC, but we're pretty sure that it was somewhere close to 1209 BC, give or take a few years. Okay, so there are other pieces of evidence, other kinds of evidence that we use to date when things happen in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world, at different locations, and we do the best that we can to stitch it all together. But there's always some amount of uncertainty because there's just not a lot of evidence. The evidence is dated, if it's dated, according to older schemes that don't use the sort of universal dating system that we use today. And then we make lots of assumptions about the synchronicity or the simultaneity of events in Egypt and Assyria and on the Phoenician coast and all of that. Okay, so I'm blabbing on and on and on about how do we date things, what kinds of evidence do we use, and there's uncertainty here. Now, that, by the way, was a section titled Chronology and Its Contents. Now we move on to who are the pharaohs of the sojourn and the Exodus. The short answer is we do not know. Unfortunately, the Bible, unfortunately or not, maybe it's not unfortunate, the Bible does not name the pharaoh of the Exodus. The Bible does not name the pharaoh of Joseph's time. The Bible does not name the pharaoh who came to power and did not know Joseph. It tells us that there was a pharaoh who did not know Joseph and who began the enslavement of the Israelites. But the Bible does not name that pharaoh. We don't get a name for a pharaoh until I didn't write it down. We don't get the name of a pharaoh until we get to the reign of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, where we hear about Pharaoh Shishak, who you can also hear about in the movie Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Shishak probably is the Israelite name for the pharaoh known to the Egyptians as Shoshank. Okay, I guess I can write that down just because it's interesting. a Q at the end. Shoshank probably is biblical Shishak. That's the first pharaoh that the Bible actually names. If the Bible had named the pharaoh of the Exodus, then we would be dealing with a completely different kettle of fish. We could maybe sort things out much more precisely. When did the Exodus happen? If the Bible actually said the pharaoh was Ramesses II, or the pharaoh was Tutmos IV, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. So we have to make use of other information, whatever evidence we can find. And there's a big question mark. Why doesn't the Bible name pharaohs in this early time? Some people decide that the Bible doesn't name pharaohs because the Exodus and the Sojourn and all the patriarchal age is fictional and made up. Or, if it happened, nothing was written down about it until hundreds of years later and people just didn't remember. Okay, that's one conclusion that many people come to. There are other possibilities. The Egyptians in this early time had their own tendency in their inscriptions not to name the kings of the countries that they defeated. They didn't dignify their enemies with names. And the Exodus story in particular is so much a story of a power struggle between Pharaoh and God that maybe the Pentateuch does not name the Pharaoh as a way of just continuing with the Egyptian practice. You guys lost. Sorry, we'll call you Pharaoh, but we're not going to dignify you with a name. That's one possibility. Ultimately, we don't know why the Bible does not name the Pharaoh. The Bible does make a number of explicit statements that we can do something with. Okay? The Bible makes explicit statements about time, peoples, and places. Time, peoples, and places. I think I'm going to erase this. I think this has served its purpose. I'm going to write some new stuff. Under the category of time, would someone please, if you have your Bible with you, find 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, and when you find that, go ahead and read it out loud.
In 480 years after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the 2nd month Ziv, he began to build the Lord's house.
Thank you, Vicki. It said right there, 480 years after the Israelites came out of Egypt, Solomon began to build the temple. That is a specific number. 480 years before Solomon began to build the temple is when the Exodus happened. For a variety of reasons that we are just not going to talk about, pretty much everybody agrees, not totally everybody, but most people agree that Solomon began building the temple around the year 970 BC. Okay? 480 years before that is 1450 BC. That is our early date for the Exodus, 1450 BC. 1 Kings 6:1 states explicitly 480 years before Solomon began building the temple is when the Exodus happened. There it is. Boom, end of story, problem solved. Right? Yeah, so not quite. there is some additional information that fits very well with this date. For instance, somebody turn to Judges chapter 11, verse 26. Judges 11, 26. What does it say?
I got you.
Okay?
For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time?
Okay, thank you. This is in the time of Jephthah, the judge. In the time of Jephthah, the judge, he's having a dispute with the king of the Ammonites. The Ammonites and the Moabites used to rule the territory east of the Jordan River on the plains of Moab and Ammon. Okay? The Arnon River is one of the rivers that cuts through that region and empties into the Jordan River. The king of Ammon is coming to Jephthah and saying, hey, you guys have these cities and these lands, you're occupying them, they belong to us. You guys stole them from us. Which in some ways sort of is true. I mean, when the conquest happened, when the Israelites came into Canaan, God gave them this land. Okay? So the king of Ammon is now coming and saying, we want it back. And Jephthah says, you can't have it back. We've been here for hundreds of years. We've been here for 300 years. You never came, none of your ancestors since that time ever came looking for these cities and lands. And now you're telling me they belong to you and you want them back. No. We've been here for 300 years. 300 years. If the Exodus took place in 1450, then after 40 years wandering in the wilderness, the beginning of the conquest of Canaan would have happened around the year 1410. 300 years later is 1110. Okay? Saul began to be king in about the year 1050. Okay. Normally, you see a more precise number like 1047, but for reasons that we've talked about, precision is not always what it seems. So around the year 1050. That's 60 years after 1110, which is when Jephthah would have been around if this is the date of the Exodus, and if his 300 years figure is correct. 60 years, that gives you time for Eli and Samuel to be around doing their thing before Saul begins to be king. That's pretty reasonable. That fits. We know that Samuel himself was an old man when the Israelites came to him and said, we want you to make a king for us. Okay? So that squares pretty well. We have a statement in 1 Kings that points to 1450 BC. We have a statement in Judges earlier than 1 Kings, which points to about the same time period. Okay? This dating scheme, the Bible says a few other things about time that don't fit quite so neatly. For instance, the Bible lists 12 generations between Jacob and David. You find that in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew spells out 14 generations from Abraham to David. Jacob is 2 generations after Abraham. So 12 generations. If we assume that a generation is 40 years long, which I think most of the time today we would not say 40 years is a generation, but in the ancient world that was a common figure. 40 years is a generation. If we assume that 12 generations, or 40 years each, that's 480 years. If we count backward from the beginning of David's reign, or from David's birth, 480 years, we end up with Jacob at the beginning of the sojourn, which lasts for 400 or 430 years, at the beginning of the sojourn, we end up with Jacob being around the year 1520. And that only leaves 70 years for slavery in Egypt, if the Exodus happened in 1450. Okay? If we use 20 years per generation, we end up with the beginning of the sojourn happening after the Exodus, if this is the date of the Exodus. So the Bible makes some explicit statements about time here and here. It makes some explicit statements about number of generations, and it's not obvious how those two sets of statements go together. Yes?
Don't they count? I think I've read somewhere that the research for generations, sometimes they skip things and it's not accurate.
That is correct.
Reference.
Yeah, sometimes generations are skipped. Probably often generations are skipped. And so it could be that the solution to this particular problem is that there wasn't really 12 generations between Jacob and David. There was more than that. We're just naming kind of the highlights. That might well be. But we don't have that information available. We don't know. And that's where I either heard this somewhere or I read it somewhere. Somebody said that archaeological evidence is always interpreted, and ancient textual evidence is always interpreted. And so even right here in the Bible, we're seeing that somehow we have to interpret something. One possible interpretation is that the genealogy for David is not complete. And if you spread that out, put more generations in, then you can take the beginning of the sojourn and push it further back, and it can make sense with this. That is a possible solution. But we don't know. All we have is an insistence, which may be symbolic or it may be abbreviated. But we have an insistence in the Old Testament and in the New Testament that there are 12 generations. That's what we have. What do we do with it? Such as that is. Overall, based on the time information, I think probably what you're getting at, Vicki, and I would agree, probably we can make it work, and we can agree that the time statements point to around 1450 BC as the date of the Exodus, roughly speaking. But that's not all that the Bible says. The Bible also talks about specific peoples. We put an S there. In particular, obviously the Bible talks about the Egyptian people. We know that that's where the Israelites were, according to the Bible. They were in ancient Egypt. They were under the rule of the Egyptians. So, that can help us identify where and to perhaps a small extent when the Exodus might have happened. The Bible also talks specifically and a lot about the Philistines. And this is very important. Or at least it would seem to be very important. I think it's very important. Exodus 13:17 talks about the way of the land of the Philistines. Okay, that would be the direct route from Egypt to Canaan would be via the way of the land of the Philistines. The Egyptians called it the ways of Horus. They had a different name for that route. Exodus 23:31 refers to the Mediterranean Sea as the Sea of the Philistines. It makes sense. The Philistines had their region that they were in charge of on the coast of Palestine. Modern day Gaza was ancient Gaza of the Philistines. It's on the coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea. So the Exodus 23:31 refers to the Sea of the Philistines. Joshua 13 spells out for the first time that there are 5 cities of the Philistines. And they are, according to Joshua 13, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. 5 cities of the Philistines. And we see those 5 cities a lot in Judges and Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Goliath, for instance, in 1 Samuel, Goliath is a Philistine from the city of Gath. Earlier, by the way, in Genesis, Abraham and Isaac have some interactions with Philistines at a city called Gerar. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce it, but that's how I pronounce it. Gerar. That was where Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, lived. Interestingly, in the Genesis account, we don't have any mention of the 5 major Philistine cities that occupy Joshua and Judges and Samuel. We also stop hearing about Gerar. It seems likely that Gerar was an early colonial outpost of the Philistines. The Philistines were probably from the Aegean Sea somewhere, and they had a colony in Canaan at Gerar. That probably is what's going on. We don't know for sure, but I'm going to go with that. And it was only later that more and more Philistines came and became powerful enough that they began to rule a larger area, and they had 5 major cities. And Gerar was not one of them. Okay? This is important because we have additional information about the Philistines from outside of the Bible. The Bible tells us that by the time Joshua was an old man, he lived to 110 years. By the time he was an old man, the Philistines were on the coast. They had these 5 cities, and they were a problem that was going to have to be dealt with eventually. They had not been dealt with yet under Joshua. Okay? We know from archaeology and text data, inscriptions, like the Merneptah stela, that the Philistines were part of a group of mysterious people called the Sea Peoples. Have any of you heard of the Sea Peoples? The Sea Peoples, we really don't know who they were. They show up, the Egyptians definitely didn't know who they were. They showed up out of nowhere, seemingly, and they were a group of people. They included people called the Shardanu, who perhaps were from Sardinia. They included people, I forget some of the other names. They included a group called the Pelasti. The Pelasti are the Palestines, the Philistines, or the Palestinians. That's where all 3 of those words are related. Palestine is named after the Philistines. The Philistines in Egyptian are called Pelasti, and they were a group of the Sea Peoples. And we know that the Sea Peoples, including the Pelasti, were coming and raiding the northern Egyptian coast and the coast of Canaan up into Phoenicia around the year 1220, starting around that year, 1220 BC. We know that Merneptah had to fight the Pelasti and the other Sea Peoples to keep them out of Egypt. And when Merneptah's son Ramses III also fought against the Sea Peoples, including the Pelasti, and defeated them, then the Sea Peoples, the Pelasti in particular, really focused on settling in Canaan, on the coastland. That's where the Philistines come from. And we've got archaeological evidence for that and textual evidence for that. We also have fashion styles, pottery styles, painting on the pottery, house layouts. Those things all become much more Aegean in Canaan at this time. Okay, so around 1220 BC is when the Philistines start showing up. So that would place the Philistines as being around already by the time Joshua is an old man. And if you figure that out, I'm talking way too long. We have only a few minutes left. If you figure that out, that leads to a date around, of the Exodus around the year 1290 BC or later. That would be sort of the earliest date you could have if you want Joshua to be an old man when the Philistines are around and established in their 5 cities. The Bible talks about places as well. Specifically, the Bible highlights in Exodus chapter 12, verse 1. Where did it go here? I didn't write it down. I think it's 12:1. The Exodus happens from the city of Pi Ramesses, or the Bible just calls it Ramesses. The Israelite slaves built Ramesses and Pithom, and they set out at the beginning of the Exodus. They set out from Ramesses. They went to Pithom, and then they continued on. We know from the archaeological record that Ramesses and Pithom are both associated with Ramesses II and his father, Sethi I. We know that Ramesses in particular had a relatively short life as a city. It was founded, or it was in use as a summer residence from around 1290, 1280 BC. Before that, we don't see that it existed. Ramesses II moved his capital there and built it up. And within a couple of hundred years, the branch of the Nile River that flowed by the city of Ramesses silted up and became unusable. And so a couple hundred years later, the pharaohs moved the capital to a nearby, another branch of the Nile, to the city called Tanis. And Tanis in the Bible is Zoan. But the point is that the place names that the Bible gives us for the Exodus are very specifically locatable to the time of Ramesses II, which gives us a date for the Exodus around 1270 BC or 1260 BC. So the place names and the peoples both point to a late date for the Exodus. Now, as always, we're interpreting things. One possibility is that somebody decided that, suppose Moses wrote the Exodus account and said that they started off from the land of Avaris, which was the capital back around this time. But later on, somebody said, we don't know where Avaris is anymore, it's been abandoned. It's at Ramesses, the location of Ramesses. So we're going to update the location in the Exodus account. That could be what happened. That reference to Ramesses is a later emendation of the text, and that everybody knew that, yeah, it's where Ramesses is located now. It's like saying, you remember where Barnes & Noble used to be in town? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not there anymore. But we could say, 10 years ago, where the Barnes & Noble was, such and such happened. Or we could say, 10 years ago, where Aldi's is, such and such happened. That's one possible interpretation of the naming of Ramesses here. Another possibility is that this 480 years is symbolic. That this is accurate, and the 480 years is really just saying, 12 generations of 40 years each. 12 and 40 are nice symbolic numbers in the Bible. After 12 generations, roughly speaking, Solomon began to build the temple. So maybe we interpret this as not being precise. Or maybe we interpret this as not being precise. or maybe there's some anachronisms in the discussions of the Philistines as well, similar to the anachronism here. Those are the kinds of issues that we run up against when we try to date the Exodus. I will just say that, I'll reiterate, I find this information to be more convincing than this information. But not everybody agrees with me on that. And some of you might disagree with me on that. And that's okay. But that's sort of that's the set of data that we're dealing with, and we have to try to figure out what's going on. Now, maybe one day, some new archaeological finds will be discovered that will clarify what looks on the surface like some sort of paradox. Maybe we won't find that evidence, and we'll be stuck forever with, I don't know, it's sometime back then, until Jesus comes back and all of that. But for now, that's where we are. I am sorry that we have gone late again, and we didn't even finish what I had planned. But I'll stop here, and I'll remind you that the written document, which has the rest of what I had planned for today, we got the main stuff. The written document will be up on the YouTube channel with the video either later today or tomorrow. Next time, we're going to talk about indirect evidence for the Exodus, namely Egyptian cultural influences on ancient Israel at this time. Okay? So, thank you very much. And in the words of Jim Goodson, have a blessed week.
Thank you.